The sun hadn't touched the horizon for 3 moons, and the earth cracked like broken bones beneath her feet. She was a female Homo habilis named Kira, her ribs showing through tattered skin, eyes sunken deep into her skull like dark caves. Behind her, the weak cries of dying children echoed through the barren wasteland that was once their fertile hunting ground. The great herds had vanished, the rivers ran dry, and somewhere in the distance, the haunting howls of starving predators grew closer each night. This is the story of humanity's darkest hour, when hunger became the ultimate predator and survival meant crossing lines that should never be crossed. When the choice wasn't between life and death, but between dying with honor ... or living as monsters. What happened next would forever change the course of human evolution, leaving scars that echo through our DNA even today. The acacia trees stood like skeletal fingers against the blood-red sky, their leaves long since withered and fallen to dust. Kira pressed her face against the hot sand, listening for the vibrations that might signal approaching prey. But the earth was silent, dead as the bones scattered around their dying camp. "Nothing," she whispered, her voice cracked like the parched ground beneath her. Her mate, Grok, lay motionless nearby, his breathing shallow and labored. Their youngest child, barely 2 seasons old, had stopped crying yesterday. The silence was more terrifying than any scream. The drought had lasted 7 moons now. What began as a slightly drier season had transformed into a nightmare that consumed everything they knew. The great river that had sustained their tribe for generations was now nothing but a serpentine scar of cracked mud, dotted with the bleached bones of animals that had died searching for water. Kira's hunting party had returned empty-handed for the 15th consecutive day. The antelope herds that once thundered across these plains like moving storms had migrated north, following the rains that never came to their homeland. The smaller game, rabbits, rodents, birds, had either fled or died, leaving behind only their tiny skeletons as monuments to the catastrophe. Mother ... came a weak voice from behind her. Her eldest son, Tam, barely 8 seasons old, crawled toward her on hands and knees. His once bright eyes were now dull as stones, his small body nothing but skin stretched over bones. "I found something." In his trembling hand was a grasshopper, its body already half desiccated by the merciless sun. Kira's stomach clenched with hunger, so intense it felt like claws tearing at her insides. She took the insect and bit into it, the bitter taste of survival flooding her mouth. "Save some for the others," Tam whispered, though they both knew this morsel wouldn't even begin to satisfy the gnawing emptiness that consumed them all. As night fell, bringing little relief from the oppressive heat, Kira gathered the remaining members of their tribe around the cold fire pit. Of the 30 souls who had celebrated the last full moon, only 12 remained. The others had simply disappeared into the darkness, their bodies too weak to continue the fight against starvation. Old Brock, the tribe's elder and keeper of stories, raised his head with tremendous effort. His lips were cracked and bleeding, his voice barely audible. "In the time of my grandfather's grandfather," he rasped, "there was another great hunger. The sun forgot how to bring rain, and the earth forgot how to give life." "What did they do?" Kira asked, though she dreaded the answer. Brack's eyes, cloudy with approaching death, fixed on hers with frightening intensity. "They survived," he said simply. "At the cost ... double quotes," he trailed off, his head falling back to the sand. That night, as the tribe slept fitfully under a sky that offered no mercy, Kira heard sounds that chilled her to the bone. Soft footsteps in the darkness, low whispers, and then a scream that was cut short too quickly. When dawn broke, revealing another pitiless day of blazing sun, she discovered that 2 more of their number had vanished in the night. But this time, they had left behind evidence of their fate, dark stains in the sand, and scattered bones that looked disturbingly familiar. The line between civilization and savagery was about to disappear entirely. Kira knelt beside the bloodstains, her hands trembling as she traced the dark patterns in the sand. The bones were unmistakably human. A femur here, ribs there, all bearing the telltale marks of stone tools. Her mind recoiled from the terrible truth, but her body understood what her consciousness refused to accept. Someone in their dying tribe had crossed the ultimate taboo. "Don't look," she whispered to Tam, pulling him away from the grisly scene. But it was too late. The boy's hollow eyes had already seen everything, and in them she witnessed the death of innocence itself. Grok struggled to sit up, his skeletal frame casting a pitiful shadow in the morning light. "Who?" he asked, though the word came out as barely more than a croak. Kira's gaze swept over the remaining survivors. 9 souls now, each one a walking corpse held together by sheer will. There was Nara, the young mother whose infant had died 3 days ago. Doc, the once powerful hunter whose muscles had wasted away to nothing. Cam and Lex, twin brothers who had always shared everything, now eyeing each other with suspicious hunger. And there was Vex, the tribe's former shaman, whose eyes now held a madness that seemed to grow stronger as his body grew weaker. "The ancestors demand sacrifice," Vex mumbled, his voice carrying an awful conviction. "The earth thirsts for blood before it will give us rain. The spirits hunger before they will send us prey." "That's not how it works," Kira snapped, but her voice lacked conviction. In truth, their old beliefs seemed meaningless now, worn away by relentless suffering like stones smoothed by an endless river. As the day progressed, the heat became unbearable. The sun seemed to pulse with malevolent intent, turning the air itself into a shimmering prison. Kira attempted to lead a hunting party to the dried riverbed, hoping against hope that some creature might have sheltered in the deeper pools that had once been their lifeline. What they found instead was horror. The riverbed was littered with the corpses of animals that had died seeking water: zebras, wildebeest, even a young elephant whose massive form had become a mountain of rotting flesh. The stench was overwhelming, but worse was the sight of other human tracks around the carcasses. Tracks that led toward the distant hills where other tribes once lived. "They're all dead," Doc whispered, his voice filled with dawning terror. "Every tribe, every group. We're alone." But they weren't alone. As they explored the carnage, they began to see signs of recent activity. Fresh tool marks on bones, new fires among the remains, and footprints that circled their position like a predator stalking wounded prey. Night fell like a black curtain, bringing with it sounds that shouldn't exist. The rhythmic pounding of drums made from human skin, voices raised in chants that spoke of hunger and desperation and things far worse than death. "They're coming," Vex said with disturbing calm. "The hunger tribes. Those who chose to live by feeding on their own kind." Kira clutched her stone axe, its familiar weight somehow comforting in a world gone mad. "How many? Does it matter?" Vex laughed, the sound like grinding bones. "Look at us. We're already half dead. They're just coming to collect what remains." In the distance, fires began to appear on the horizon, not the warm, welcoming fires of civilization, but the cold, predatory flames of those who had abandoned humanity entirely. The war drums grew louder, and with them came the sound of voices raised in a terrible hunger song. Kira pulled her surviving family close, feeling their bones through their paper-thin skin. Tomorrow, she realized with crystal clarity, they would face a choice that would damn them no matter what they decided. Fight and die with honor, or surrender to the darkness and become something that was no longer recognizably human. The hunger tribes were coming, and they were very, very hungry.
The dawn brought no relief. Only the sight of smoke rising from dozens of fires that had appeared during the night, like malevolent stars fallen to earth. Kira shielded her eyes against the merciless sun and counted the columns of smoke. 20, 30, perhaps more. Each one represented a group of survivors who had made the unthinkable choice. They had chosen to live as predators of their own kind. The war drums had never stopped, their rhythm now synchronized into a hypnotic pulse that seemed to match the beating of her terrified heart. Between the distant fires, she could see movement figures that walked upright like humans, but moved with the calculated stalking gait of apex predators. "How long do we have?" Grok asked, his voice barely a whisper. Kira studied the approaching smoke. "Hours. Maybe less." The remaining 9 had become 8 during the night. Old Brock had simply stopped breathing, his body finally surrendering to the inexorable hunger that had been consuming him from within. They had no energy left to mourn him properly, no resources to honor his passing with ritual. He lay where he had died, already beginning to attract the attention of the few carrion birds that still survived in this wasteland. Tam tugged at his mother's arm with skeletal fingers. "Who are they, Mother? Why do they hunt us?" How could she explain? How could she tell her child that somewhere out in that hellish landscape, humans had discovered that the easiest prey was other humans? That when all other food sources vanished, the line between predator and cannibal became meaningless. "They were people like us," she said finally, but the hunger changed them, made them into something else. Vex, the mad shaman, cackled with delight. Not something else, something more. They learned the secret that we're too weak to embrace. Flesh feeds flesh. Blood feeds blood. The strong consume the weak, and thus the species survives. Nara, still clutching the dried remains of her dead infant, looked up with eyes that had seen too much. "My baby," she whispered. "I could have. I should have. ... double quotes." "No," Kira said sharply. "We don't cross that line. We die as humans, not as monsters." But even as she spoke the words, she felt their hollowness. What was humanity worth if it led only to extinction? What was on Earth it meant watching her children waste away into nothing? The first scouts appeared by midday, 3 figures moving with unnatural coordination across the wasteland. At this distance, they still looked human. But something about their movement patterns triggered every survival instinct Kira possessed. They moved like a hunting pack, communicating through gestures that spoke of long practice and coordinated stalking. "They're testing us," Doc observed, hefting a stone spear with hands that could barely grip its weight. "Seeing how we react, how we defend ourselves." The scouts circled their position for an hour, staying just at the edge of spear-throwing range. Occasionally one would stand upright and make sounds. Not quite words, but not quite animal calls either. A language evolved for hunting humans. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, the main force appeared on the horizon. Kira's blood turned to ice water as she counted their numbers. At least 40 individuals, all armed, all moving, with the terrible purpose of professional killers. They carried spears and clubs and knives, but also trophies that made her stomach clench with revulsion. Necklaces of human teeth. Clubs decorated with finger bones, and stretched between poles, like banners of victory, the preserved skins of their previous victims. "We run," she decided suddenly. "Now, while we still can." But Vex blocked their path, his eyes blazing with fanatical intensity. "Running is death. Fighting is death. There is only one choice left, and you know what it is." He pointed at old Brack's cooling corpse. "Fresh meat! Right here. We take what we need to survive, and maybe, we live long enough to find water, find prey, find hope." The hunger tribes drew closer, their war drums now so loud they seemed to shake the very ground. In the distance, Kira could hear other sounds. The screams of victims being taken alive, the wet sounds of feeding, the awful laughter of those who had abandoned their humanity entirely. Tam looked up at his mother with eyes too old for his years. "Will we become like them?" Kira gripped her weapon tighter, feeling the weight of impossible choices crushing down upon her like fallen stones. The hunger tribes were almost within spear range now, and she could see their faces clearly for the first time. They had once been human. But hunger had carved away everything soft, everything civilized, everything that connected them to the species they had been born into. What remained was efficient, ruthless, and absolutely without mercy. The choice was no longer about survival. It was about what kind of creature she was willing to become in order to see another sunrise.
The attack came with the setting sun, painting the massacre in shades of blood and gold. Kira barely had time to scream a warning before the first wave of hunger tribes crashed into their pathetic defensive circle like a tsunami of teeth and claws and sharpened stone. These were no longer humans fighting for survival. They were apex predators who had perfected the art of hunting their former species. Doc fell first, his stone spear snapping like a twig against the coordinated assault of 3 attackers. They brought him down with surgical precision, hamstring him to prevent escape, then pinning him alive while they began their grisly work. His screams cut through the air like a blade, but they ended too quickly, not from death, but from something far worse. They were keeping him conscious while they fed. Kira grabbed Tam and ran, her skeletal legs finding strength she didn't know she still possessed. Behind her, she could hear Nara's final cry as she was overwhelmed, followed by the wet sounds of immediate consumption. The hunger tribes didn't kill for sport or vengeance. They killed for sustenance, and they wasted nothing. This way, Grok shouted, pointing toward a cluster of fallen rocks that might offer temporary shelter. But his voice was so weak that Kira barely heard him over the chaos. When she turned back, he was gone, simply vanished into the writhing mass of predators who moved with the coordinated efficiency of a wolf pack. Vex was still standing in the center of the carnage, his arms raised to the darkening sky. "Yes!" he screamed in ecstasy. "This is how we survive. This is how we evolve. The weak feed the strong." One of the hunger tribe leaders approached him, a female whose body bore the ritual scars of countless feeds. Her teeth had been filed to points, and necklaces of human finger bones rattled with each step. She studied Vex with the calculating gaze of a predator evaluating potential prey. But instead of attacking, she spoke. The words were in their language, but twisted by practices that had changed the very shape of her mouth. "You understand," she said. "You see the truth." Vex nodded eagerly. "The hunger is the teacher. The hunger is the path." She smiled, revealing those filed teeth in all their terrible glory. "Then you may choose. Join us or feed us. But choose quickly." Kira pressed herself against the rocks, holding Tam so tightly she feared she might break his fragile bones. Around them, the feeding continued with methodical efficiency. The hunger tribes had clearly done this many times before. They knew exactly how to process their prey for maximum nutrition and minimum waste. Some victims were killed quickly and cleanly. Others were kept alive longer, their screams serving as both seasoning and psychological warfare against any who might resist. The smell of cooking meat began to fill the air as fires were lit and crude spits constructed from human bones. "We have to run," she whispered to Tam, when they're distracted by the ... By the feeding, we run toward the old caves. But Tam wasn't looking at her. His hollow eyes were fixed on the feast with an expression she had never seen before. Not horror, not revulsion, but something that made her blood freeze in her veins. Hunger. Pure. Desperate. Overwhelming hunger. "It smells ... Key whispered. "It smells like food." Kira's world tilted sideways as she realized the truth. Her son, her beautiful, innocent boy, was already crossing the line she had sworn never to approach. The hunger had won, not through violence or force, but through the simple biological imperative to survive at any cost. One of the hunting leaders noticed them huddled among the rocks. She approached with that same predatory grace, her spear held casually but ready to strike. "Female with young," she called to her companions. "Fresh breeding stock?" Another hunter, this one decorated with an elaborate headdress of human scalps, shook his head. "Too weak. Look at them. They're already dying. We'd barely lost the season." "Then we feed," the female said simply. Kira gripped her stone axe, knowing it was useless against trained killers, but unable to surrender without a fight. "Stay behind me," she told Tam. But when she looked back, he was gone. She found him 30 paces away, approaching the central fire where Vex was being offered a bowl made from a human skull. The contents steamed in the cooling night air, and the smell that rose from it was the most tempting thing Kira had experienced in 7 moons of starvation. One bite, Vex was saying to Tam, his voice gentle as a father's. Just one bite, and the hunger stops. One bite, and you become strong enough to survive until the rains return. Tam reached for the bowl with trembling hands. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled across the starless sky. But whether it promised salvation or just another cruel trick of the dying world, Kira could no longer tell. Thunder crashed overhead like the anger of abandoned gods, but no rain fell from the iron-gray clouds that had gathered with supernatural swiftness. The Hunger Tribes looked up with expressions of annoyance rather than hope. They had learned not to trust the sky as promises. Tam's small hands wrapped around the skull bowl, steam rising between his fingers like incense from a cursed altar. The liquid within was dark and rich, carrying the metallic scent of life itself. His hollow eyes reflected the dancing flames as he raised it toward his cracked lips. "No," Kira breathed, but her voice carried no strength. She had been running on nothing but maternal instinct for hours, and even that was beginning to fade. Vex placed a skeletal hand on Tam's shoulder, his touch gentle despite the madness in his eyes. "The ancestors did this," he whispered. "In the great hunger before memory, they made the choice that let us survive. This is not evil, child. This is evolution." The hunting leader with the scalp headdress watched the scene with professional interest. "The female objects?" she observed to her companions. "She still clings to the old taboos." "Give her time," another replied, casually gnawing on what had once been someone's forearm. "Hunger teaches better than words." Kira stumbled forward, her vision blurring from exhaustion and horror. "Please," she gasped. "He's just a child. Let him die clean." The female hunter studied her with those predatory eyes, and for a moment Kira thought she saw something that might have once been compassion. "Clean death is luxury," she said finally. "We abandoned luxury 7 seasons ago." Around the central fire, the feeding continued with ritualistic precision. The Hunger Tribes had developed an entire culture around their necessary cannibalism. Prayers to thank the consumed, songs to honor their sacrifice, ceremonies to ensure that no part of the gift was wasted. They had transformed survival horror into spiritual practice. "Look at them," Vex said to Tam, gesturing at the feasting figures. "Strong, healthy. Their children will see the next full moon. Can you say the same about your path?" Lightning illuminated the scene in stark black and white. Predators and prey locked in the eternal dance of survival, the line between them blurred beyond recognition. In that moment of absolute clarity, Kira saw the truth that had been stalking her since the drought began. They were all already dead, had been dead for moons. The only choice was how long to delay the inevitable, and what they were willing to become in those final moments. Tam raised the bowl higher. The liquid touched his lips. Then, impossibly, the first drops of rain began to fall. Not the gentle promise of coming storms, but real water falling from the sky in fat. Heavy drops that hissed against the cooking fires and drummed against the hard-packed earth. The Hunger Tribes looked up in confusion and dawning fear. Rain was life. But life was the enemy of their carefully constructed death culture. "The spirits reject our offering," one whispered. "No," the scalp-adorned leader snarled. "Weather means nothing. The choice is made. The boy drinks, or he dies." But Tam had lowered the bowl, his face turned upward to catch the precious drops on his tongue. For the first time in 7 moons, he was drinking something other than blood or tears. The rain intensified, becoming a proper shower, then a downpour. Steam rose from the parched earth like the sighs of the grateful dead. In the distance, Kira could hear something that made her heart stop with disbelief. the low rumble of running water as the dried riverbeds began to fill. "It's not enough," Vex screamed over the growing storm. "The damage is done. The prey is gone. We are what we are now." But even as he spoke, other sounds began to filter through the rain. The distant calls of animals following the storm front south, the rustle of insects emerging from their hiding places, the splash of fish swimming upstream in the newly flowing rivers. Life was returning to the wasteland. The hunger tribes looked at each other with expressions of dawning uncertainty. Their leader gripped her spear tighter, but Kira could see doubt creeping into those predatory eyes. Rain meant the return of normal prey. Rain meant they might have choices again. Rain meant they might have to face what they had become. One by one, the hunters began to drift away from the fires, melting back into the storm like shadows fleeing the dawn. They had learned to survive in the land of the dead, but they had no place in the world of the living. Kira gathered Tam in her arms, feeling his body shake with something that might have been relief or might have been withdrawal from the hunger that had been consuming him from within. But as she held him close, she noticed that his hands still trembled toward the abandoned skull bowl, and his eyes still held shadows that hadn't been there before the drought began. Some hungers, she realized with growing horror, were harder to satisfy than others. 3 days of rain had transformed the wasteland into something that almost resembled the world Kira remembered from before the Great Dying. Green shoots pushed through the muddy earth like fingers of resurrection, and the sound of flowing water had become a constant lullaby of hope and renewal. But some changes could not be washed away by any amount of rain. Kira sat beside the swollen river, watching Tam play in the shallows. To any observer, he looked like a normal child rediscovering joy after trauma, laughing as small fish darted between his fingers, marveling at the dragonflies that had appeared as if by magic. But she knew better. She had seen what lived behind his eyes now. The hunger tribes had vanished with the dawn after the rains began, fading into the landscape like a fever dream. But they had left marks that went deeper than scars, wounds that no amount of fresh water could heal. Vex had chosen to go with them. "This is not over," he had said as he gathered his few possessions. "This is just intermission. The drought will come again. Maybe not this season, maybe not for generations, but it will come. And when it does," he had looked directly at Tam when he spoke those final words. Now, as Kira watched her son catch minnows with his bare hands, she noticed things that chilled her blood. The way he examined each fish before releasing it, as if calculating its nutritional value. The way his eyes tracked the movements of birds overhead with a predator's intensity. The way he had started hoarding food, hiding scraps of meat and dried berries in secret caches around their temporary shelter. The boy was preparing, not for another drought, but for another hunger. "Mother," Tam called from the water, holding up a particularly large fish. "Should I kill it?" The question was innocent enough, but something in his tone made her skin crawl. "Only if you're hungry," she replied carefully. "I'm always hungry," he said simply, and she realized with crystal clarity that this was no longer the normal hunger of a growing child. This was something else entirely, a constant, gnawing need that food could fill but never truly satisfy. Other survivors began to appear as the rains continued. Scattered individuals in small groups who had somehow endured the Great Dying without crossing the ultimate line. They were skeletal, traumatized, but fundamentally still human in ways that mattered. Most of them avoided Kira and Tam after the first few encounters. "There's something wrong with the boy," she overheard one woman whisper to her companion. "The way he looks at my daughter, like she's made of meat." Kira wanted to defend him, to explain that he was just traumatized. That time would heal the wounds left by their ordeal. But late at night, when she thought he was sleeping, she sometimes caught him staring at her with that same calculating gaze, as if he were measuring her weight, estimating her nutritional value, planning for contingencies she couldn't bear to imagine. The worst part was that she understood the temptation. Even now, with fresh water and returning game, she sometimes found herself looking at others and remembering the smell that had risen from the hunger tribe's fires. Her mouth would water involuntarily, and she would have to force herself to look away. They had all been changed by the great hunger. The only difference was how much of their humanity they had managed to retain. One evening, as they sat around their small fire watching sunset paint the recovering landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Tam asked the question she had been dreading. "Will it happen again? The drought?" She said, though she knew that wasn't what he meant. "The choice," he clarified. "When the next bad time comes, will we have to choose again?" Kira looked into his young face, still recognizably her child, but marked now by knowledge that no child should possess. "I hope not," she said finally. "But if we do?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from the dying fire. In the distance, she could hear the sounds of the recovering world. Night birds calling, insects chirping, the splash of fish jumping in the flowing river. Life returning to a land that had forgotten what life meant. But she could also hear other sounds if she listened carefully enough. The distant howls of things that had learned to hunt in packs. The rustle of movement in the darkness beyond the firelight. The whispered conversations of survivors who had made different choices during the Great Dying, and who were still making those choices even now. "If we do," she said quietly, "then we'll face it when it comes. But until then, we try to remember what we were before the hunger. We try to hold on to the parts of ourselves that are worth saving." Tam nodded solemnly, then returned his attention to the small animal bone he had been carving with his knife. It was taking shape slowly, a whistle, or perhaps a flute, something to make music in the long nights ahead. But as Kira watched him work, she noticed that he was carving it in the exact pattern she had seen decorating the bone tools of the hunger tribes. The same ritual marks, the same symbolic notches. Some knowledge once gained could never be forgotten. Some hungers, once awakened, never truly slept. And somewhere in the darkness beyond their fire, she was certain she could hear the sound of distant drums, keeping time with a rhythm that spoke of patience, preparation, and the certainty that the wheel would turn again. The Great Dying was over. But the Great Hunger was just beginning to evolve. In the recovered lands, tribes would tell stories of the Great Drought for generations to come. But they would speak in whispers of those who survived it, and their children, and their children's children. For some knowledge runs deeper than memory, and some appetites grow stronger with each passing season. The drought had ended, but humanity itself had been fundamentally changed.